Hello and welcome to this edition of City Hall Insider. I'm Jim Marshall of the New Bedford Cable Network, and with us today, he's new, but he's in the chair right now, Josh Amaral, who is the Director of Housing and Urban Development for the City of New Bedford. Haven't been there long, and you're already busy as a beaver, really, when you come right down to it.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I appreciate you having me on. It's definitely been kind of a shotgun start on the in the job, but I think that was part of the appeal in taking on this work is that largely it's a continuation of what I was doing before, just switching teams and doing it for the city now. So I'm excited about all the things we've got going on.
Lots to talk about, and I think the big thing, obviously, is what the mayor has been doing, and you're sort of spearheading too, is that the housing initiatives that are coming out, and it's all sort of related, housing, homelessness, what have you. There's a lot of things that are intertwined together. First of all, for people who don't know, I mean, I think people are, when we say housing issues, what are we dealing with right now? What are we looking at from your standpoint?
Yeah, I think housing is one of the top issues in the city right now. I think it's on the tip of everybody's tongue. If you are not personally affected by it, you definitely know someone who is. Talk to a lot of people who, they maybe bought their house years ago and they're not worried about affordability so much because their mortgage is pretty much the same as it's always been. But they might have an aging parent that's looking to downsize and find an apartment, or lived in one place for a long time and the landlord's selling the place and they have to find somewhere else to move to. Talk to a lot of people who have children who are graduating college and want to move back home and get a job, but they want to live in their own place. They're used to the college environment. They can't find a place to live either. And then we hear stories, far too many stories of residents who are just struggling to make the rent every month. So we've seen a pretty dramatic uptick in rents here in the city. I think a lot of people are sort of desensitized to it. If you own an apartment, you own your own home, and you've been sort of out of the market for a while, you might still believe that New Bedford is the place where there's a lot of $800 a month, $1,000 a month apartments. But in the last couple of years, really since the pandemic, the average rents have soared. I think you're seeing units now regularly $1,500, $1,700, $1,800.
Well, they've doubled in many cases. I mean, I know the apartments in my neighborhood, you had $900 and then all of a sudden they're $1,800.
Yeah.
Now the developer or the investor put work into the house to make it better, but you're still doubling the rent.
Yeah.
Is it a question of, and maybe it's all three for people who don't understand, is it a question of stock? There's not enough houses for sale, not enough apartments available?
Yep. All of it.
All of it.
Yeah, so I think there's a few different aspects of it, but mostly New Bedford's problems are not unique to New Bedford. The region is impacted by it. The entire state is impacted by it. You hear Governor Healy, you heard previous Governor Baker talk about this all the time, and they've introduced some changes to the law to try to stimulate housing growth around the state. It's really a national problem. So there's a study, and we mentioned it in the housing plan, that says that the country is short 4 million housing units to meet the demand. Massachusetts is short over 100,000 housing units, and some people would say even more than that. So in New Bedford, we have approximately 50,000, 60,000 housing units in a given year, and you wonder if we're 2,000 or 3,000 units short, just as a rough estimate. So you have to figure out how to produce those units. The problem is it's
when you speak units, you're talking still rental and ownership, right?
Yeah, I would say any housing unit is productive in helping us solve the problem. Now, generally, we think of multifamily housing. So the state policy changes that we've seen in recent years is really to incentivize multifamily housing in surrounding communities. So New Bedford is known for largely as an apartment rental type community, but some of the leafy suburb towns around us are almost entirely single family homes. So as you look at the state and go, well, we need to add more housing units, how do we do that? Those places have generally more buildable land than a place like New Bedford does, but that doesn't mean New Bedford shouldn't be looking for opportunities to build as well. We all have to figure out how to add more units to try to meet that demand. The only way to control price, the only way to try to make a difference in terms of affordability for the average people is to introduce more units to the market.
I don't know how many houses are available right now in Bristol County. I was reading an article over the weekend. They were talking about the Cape housing. There's at this moment, there's only 140 units for sale in the Cape.
Yeah.
Right now, from the bridge to P-Town, there's 140 houses for sale.
Yeah.
Which is unbelievably.
And we haven't even hit the peak season,
right?
In terms of the real estate market. You also have interest rates that are higher than they've been in decades. and yet the market still continues all the same. It's similar with apartments. So if you go to apartments.com or Zillow or any of these sites and look for an apartment in New Bedford, you might find 3 or 4 results. So where you used to have like an abundance of affordable apartments, they're just much more scarce nowadays. So landlords have the ability to charge more.
I was going to say the competition. So if you're willing to pay $100 more a month.
Exactly. And now if your landlord approaches you as a tenant and says, we have to raise the rent a few $100s, you may not be able to afford that, or you might be stressed out by that. And typically in a different time you'd go, well, forget this. I'm going to go move to another place that's in my budget. But if you can't find that place, you don't have as many options. So there are some things that we can do in the short term, things we can do in the long term, but it's definitely a problem that requires a response.
Do you see that people who are in existing homes, as you touched upon it, there are people who've been in their homes for a while now, that they're not moving? So people in New Bedford, in a sense, that have existing home mortgages, they're staying put.
Yeah, that's part of the sort of the stagnation of the market. So people stay put where they are for a variety of reasons. I'll give you my own example. My wife and I bought a house in the city in 2019. We capitalized on those really low interest rates. I think our interest rate's around 3%. And so we had a baby over the summer. This is about the time you'd start to look and go, our 1,000 square foot, one level house, maybe is getting a little small for us. Let's upgrade, right? But to upgrade would almost double our mortgage because 6 or 7% interest rates instead of the 3% we're looking at. Plus, we bought our house at a reasonable price a few years ago.
Right.
Our house would probably sell for a lot more than we paid for it, and so to upgrade would be a real hit to the household budget, if you will. A lot of people face similar situations, so they stay put in their starter homes, and now there might have been a renter that was going to move out of their apartment, as we did, move into the starter home, but we're clogging up the starter home, so they stay in their apartment. And now when your kids graduate college and want to come back to the city, they'd rent that apartment, but they can't because that person's staying in place. So I think the lack of vacancy across the board, the lack of movement across the board, only contributes to the affordability hikes we see.
So the city has this program now, and the mayor announced it at the press conference recently, Building New Bedford Strategies to Promote Attainable Housing for All in a Thriving New Bedford. And the booklet is right there. There are 22 measures in the plan, divided into 6 main areas. One, and we can talk about these too and sort of give a breakdown for the people that don't know. The first one, facilitating new housing production across income levels. So what are we looking at when we talk about that?
Yeah, so this is purely looking at that supply and demand problem, right? And we just decide, we don't have enough units to meet the demand of the market. We need to get more online as quickly as we can. In most cases, that requires new building or requires renovating existing buildings. So we're talking about facilitating that, working with developers. The city's not really in the business of building housing and doing renovations of housing. It's a private developer problem. But what we see in other places that have built more housing stably over time is that they've removed barriers to development. So they want people to get through planning processes quickly. They want them to get their permits quickly. They want to know that the city's open for business and that we are prioritizing housing development because there's a lot of involvement of municipal government in enabling these projects to work. So whether it's finding sites, marketing them, taking developers on tours and saying, look, here's some sites that we have available in the city. Here's what you could kind of build there. Here's what's allowed in our zoning code, and here's the process to doing that. We find that's a really effective tool to stimulating that type of development. New Bedford is, in essence, in competition with every other city and town in Massachusetts that's trying to do pretty much the same things. So we have to hustle to get that investment. We don't have some of the same advantages in Boston. One of the problems that we faced, and developers say this all the time, is that if they want to make a $20 million investment and do a big development of a 50 or 60 unit building, it costs pretty much the same to build that in New Bedford as it does in Boston. But in New Bedford, you might rent the units for $1,500 a piece, and in Boston, you might rent them for $4,000.
Right.
So time and time again, they choose to do it in Boston. We can't totally close that gap by just being more efficient, but we can certainly help things along by taking a pro-development approach.
Is it hard to get developers interested? And this is you look at, and you and I were talking off camera, you see spaces. Yeah. And we can talk about the Holy Family Apartments, which is on my list, which, again, there was a tour recently that everybody went in. It's going to be turned into apartments. Mm-hmm. There are other buildings like that. What are the roadblocks, or what are the things you find with those type of buildings?
Yeah, so that really gets into the second bucket of the plan, which is maximizing the existing stock and space that we have. So looking at buildings like Holy Family, right, which sat vacant for 3, almost 4 decades, right there in the city's west end, off of County and Hillman, in that area. It's a building that has ample space. It's going to be relatively close distance to the train station. It's close to downtown. Amenities, restaurants, all the great things in that neighborhood. It's an attractive place to develop and live, but it really took a local developer that has a connection to the community to make that investment. It's a struggle sometimes to attract developers to projects like that one, because typically it's a lot of work. There's a lot of challenges to get through in terms of navigating city government to get those projects authorized and moving. Financing them is not easy. That project, I think, has 6 or 7 different funding sources, some of them public government sources, some of them bank lending, and so forth. You stitch all that together to produce a development, but it's a lot of work for 15 units in that case.
And they're trying to turn a profit, too, the developers. They're trying to make money.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, a developer has to put out all the risk, right? So they bought the building. They've paid an architect to design the plans for that building. They're paying the debt on the building. They're paying interest every month on the project. They have to arrange contractors to get started on the work, and in some cases, developers are putting out hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, on the front end before construction even starts. So there's a big risk on their part, and sometimes, for every few projects that work out great, there's going to be one that doesn't work out at all. So developers put up all this investment on the front end only for the project not to work. Now, look, that's the cost of doing business in most cases.
Right.
But there is some risk involved. So developers want to determine that they're gonna, like any business person, that they're gonna make some money in getting that out. And the city doesn't oppose the concept of a developer making money. We need developers to want to invest in the city, to build the housing, to help make our housing more affordable. So it makes all the sense in the world. We don't want greed. We don't want exorbitant rents and projects that aren't going to make sense for our community because they're shooting for the moon in terms of monthly rent prices and things like that. We need projects that are geared toward the market here. That's a good example of one.
But you are seeing that. You are seeing out of town, not developers, but you're seeing other out of town landlords in a sense coming in, and they're jacking up those rental prices.
Yeah, I think in an environment like we're in right now, where real estate investing is both common and it's been pretty lucrative for people. Folks have figured out, we could buy these tenement houses in Boston or Quincy or Cambridge or wherever, and a 3-family house there might be $1 million. But down here, 50, 60 miles away, you could buy that same house for half the price. So, I'll buy 2 down there, for the same price, and I'll have 6 units for the same deal. So you've just seen an outgrowth of the market altogether. It's not so much that we see sort of this influx of folks from Boston into the community, but we see Boston growing out into an area beyond Greater Boston, into Brockton, Taunton, et cetera. And then we see people in those communities being pushed out for affordability reasons into Fall River, New Bedford, and so forth. So this is an impact all over the place, and it's all regarding the just the nationwide and statewide housing boom.
Josh Amaral is our guest. He is the Director of Housing and Community Development for the City of New Bedford. As we look at it, you also want to promote home ownership and independent living, obviously trying to get people to buy homes in New Bedford.
Yeah, so we put forth a new and enhanced first-time homebuyer program in the plan, which will allow eligible homeowners to get up to $40,000 in down payment assistance through our program. That should help get people, perhaps renters currently, into single-family homes and free up those rental units, as well as just spur investment in the city. We want people to be able to stay here. Nobody should have to leave the city of New Bedford because they want to move into a single-family home and they can't find one here. So we want to solve that problem. As far as we want to also keep people in their homes to the degree that we can. Seniors, we know are stretched, household budgets are tight, food's more expensive than ever, prescriptions are more expensive than ever. We know taxes go up. We know, everything.
And we've heard that. I mean, the taxes, people are going before the council saying my taxes as senior citizens, my taxes are too high and I can't afford to live here. Yeah,
and so one of the things that we've put forward in the plan is some of these assistance programs. Some of them have existed through our office before, but again, we're gonna expand them. Things like roofs. We have a lot of people that contact us and say, my roof needs to be repaired. It's in really poor shape. I don't have the finances to do it. What can your office do for us? And so we've got some programs that are loans or grants, and we can work with eligible homeowners around some of those emergency repairs, keep their home buttoned up, and also keep another affordable house on the market for so many more years.
You hear the word gentrification too when you're talking about housing and for elderly. For those that don't know, tell us a little bit what that is and what are the issues with it?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a tricky one because I think across the country you hear a lot about gentrification. Just about everybody I talk to has like their own sort of interpretation or own definition of it. Generally, gentrification is like an influx of higher income people into a community that's being like rapidly redeveloped, right? So I think Boston, to some degree, has been gentrified over the years. You hear about like Brooklyn and some pockets of New York that the perception, 40 or 50 years ago was it was like this gritty, kind of unsafe place, and now it's like almost like Disneyland. It's just totally changed composition.
Right.
And in the process, a lot of elderly, low-income individuals, people of color, have been pushed out of those communities entirely by the new people that have moved in. You see this a lot in places where there's like a big tech boom, and there's a bunch of people with really high incomes moving into a community all at once, and sort of displacing people. In New Bedford, I think we've seen some displacement, right? So as a result of this housing crunch everywhere, we see people that used to be able to afford $1,000 a month. Their landlords raise the rent to $1,500 and they can't afford it, so they might have to move in with a relative. We've heard some people move to Florida or move to a place in the country where housing is a little bit cheaper. We don't want that. We want New Bedford to be livable for all of its residents, and so we think the answer is producing more housing and doing that. I think the causes are a little different than some other places that have experienced gentrification in a more severe way. So we don't necessarily have this influx of economic activity, and that's really pushing people out. We do have some things happening, whether it's South Coast Rail, you hear some talk about that, whether it's the offshore wind industry, that might bring in some workers temporarily that will take housing units. It's tough because for me, I always want to separate out like positive community development, right? We want the city to look better. We want there to be cooler restaurants and great shops and all around better quality of life. But we know that when you create those things, that also makes the city more attractive to people that are not necessarily from the city. Right. And that might bring with it, right, more competition for housing here. In normal times where the market isn't so tight, you could probably get away with that without much of a problem. Here, I think we need a little bit more of an intentional strategy just to make sure the city does stay livable and that nobody's pushed into these situations that are too unfortunate where people can't afford to live here. So the answer is, let's build enough new housing units so that anybody that wants to move into New Bedford can move in without getting into a bidding war with, my aunt or your uncle for the same apartment that they've lived in maybe all their lives.
Another thing on the plan here is update regulatory framework, as you were talking about, sort of making the process easier, I'm assuming.
Yeah, this ties in with facilitating new housing production, but again, developers may not have as strong an economic incentive to develop in New Bedford as they have in other places. So the best we can do, we can try to close that gap somehow by helping them navigate the funding sources that are available. But more importantly, we can remove regulatory barriers that might give them trouble. So I talked to a developer the other day that wants to develop an 80-unit complex, or approximately 80 units. And they said, are you serious about the regulatory reform stuff? Because right now you require 2 parking spaces per unit in my development. So I'd have to have 160 parking spaces. Right. It's going to take up a lot of space. It's gonna, I said, yeah, we'd like to pursue a policy that's 1.5, particularly for smaller units where we know there might be one person living in them. Right. Units that are closer to train stations where people will probably walk and commute to work that way. Different scenarios like that one. And they said, well, that would be great because I'd be able to get another 10 units built with the space that I would have allocated to parking, right? Or I only have room for X number of parking spots, so I couldn't build more housing units. And so these things are all related. Similarly, developers typically hire attorneys to represent them before the planning board, before the zoning board, and all those things. So the more that you can confine that to just the essentials, we want to make sure that New Bedford's historic architecture is preserved. We want to make sure that the city looks great. We want to make sure that the city's well planned and we're taking all those things into consideration. But we don't want people to be brought into these really expansive processes. So we set a goal of 90 days. You should be able to start your project, talk to us informally about your project, get things moving, and get fully permitted within 90 days, ideally 60 days. That way you can get construction moving even quicker. In cases where you can't do that, it would be really through extenuating circumstances. There's been a few too many developments in recent years that have kind of languished and gone on longer than that. Some projects have never come to fruition as a result of hitting a snag somewhere in the process, and I think in 2023, 2024, we just can't afford to operate that way.
Establish a regional approach on the housing issues, another one of the measures that you're looking at. You were kind of touching upon that the suburbs really have more land when you really think about it to build housing. But you, the mayor, want New Bedford to be the leader, though.
Yes. So, New Bedford's the city. It's the heart of Greater New Bedford, of course, right? And we know that we have to lead the way in everything that we do. So we're not shirking our responsibilities to develop more housing and to be innovative in our plans and executing our plans. At the same time, we do think that the problem goes well beyond New Bedford's borders, and the towns around us have to be part of the solution. You hear this echoed in state policy all the time. So Governor Baker pushed through housing choice legislation, which changed zoning board rules. So you used to need a supermajority of a zoning board to make a change. Now it's just a simple majority. And I'll tell you why that matters, Jim. So there used to be in a town where somebody would propose maybe an affordable housing complex with low-income housing, family housing. There'd be some neighbors who'd go, I don't really think that we want that in our neighborhood. That sounds like a negative thing. Of course, we know it's not, but people would rally, and it would be very difficult to get authorization for those projects to proceed in those places. So too far often in Massachusetts history, not just our surrounding towns, but too far often, multifamily housing, affordable housing, family housing in suburban communities has been blocked. Governor Healy and Governor Baker both proposed legislation regarding the MBTA communities. So virtually every community in Massachusetts is an MBTA community, even though that's a relatively new thing for us down here in the South Coast. But this proposes rules for cities and towns that have train stations in them have to have a certain housing density, meaning there have to be a certain number of housing units within the train station range. And then abutting communities, so you might not have to have a train station, but you are on the border of a city that does, or a town that does. They're required to have a zone where multifamily housing development is allowed as of right. So a developer can propose a multifamily project development in that zone, in that area of the town, and they don't need approval from the town to do it. And so those are fairly landmark changes that are going to change, in some ways, the way that towns have operated in terms of housing development, which doesn't mean that we're calling for towns to change their essential character, to change the fabric of the town. But if you have ample buildable land and we have a housing shortage, a housing crisis that's affecting everybody in the state, you got to step up a little bit and be part of the solution. So where you can, develop.
Last one too, the last measure, addressing housing instability and homelessness, sort of takes into talks about a recent announcement that the city received, I think, $2.7 million for homelessness initiatives.
Yeah.
Kind of ties into that.
It does, yeah. So I could touch on that. So I mean, the reality is, as we're talking here today, I'm talking about stimulating housing development, building hundreds, if not thousands, of more units in our region in the next few years. But we know that these things take time. So even if we had a developer on board today, it takes time to design. It takes time to go through these regular.
You're talking years.
90 days. Years. I mean, if a
the bigger the site, I guess.
Yeah, a project is proposed today, it's probably 2 years at minimum till it's really built out. If it's a large development, some of the smaller conversions and things like that we could do a little bit simpler, but it takes time. And as we're talking today, we know that there are too many people that are experiencing homelessness, whether they're sleeping in a car, they're doubled up at a friend's house, or they're just on the brink. They're one rent payment away. They're looking at the calendar, and we're filming this on the 24th. They're looking at May 1st right around the corner and going, I don't have it this month. My rent is too high and I can't afford it. So we need some supports for folks like that as well, because we have longer term solutions, we have medium term solutions, but we're looking at a week out for someone who might be struggling. So we need to make sure that we have those programs available. Rental assistance being one of them. We also want to look at the way that we offer homeless services in the city too. So our office has a huge role in monitoring and managing the continuum of care, the homeless service providers network. And so coming into the position. I mean, I'm certainly familiar with that world and that work, but I want to take stock of our perspective of it and look, are there things that we can do differently? Are there things that we could do better? Do we have the right agencies at the table? Are they doing the right things? And so we put in the plan a study to really analyze that and dive deeper into that. And we want to have solutions that make sense for everybody. So whether that's someone who's struggling today, someone that's struggling tomorrow, someone that's just aspiring to own a home, or someone that needs to move back into the community or is looking for an affordable rental unit, our plan really runs the gamut of all those things.
Got a couple minutes left, but I can't help but thinking that the city has some examples of success stories when you're looking at the mills that have been turned into housing that have been great success. A couple of different projects. And I would think that developers would look at that and say, well, it just kind of opens some eyes, I would think.
Yeah.
I mean, I know it comes down to dollars and cents for them, but it seems as though the city has success stories like that.
Absolutely. I mean, the city's done a great job over the years of developing some of those projects, and they really examples that the rest of the state followed. So many of those developments happened like the early mid 2000s.
Right.
And, a few of them a little bit later. We were just part of the completion of the Cliftex 2 project up the north end, which was those mills were developed years ago, and then the second phase was just kind of completed. I think it was 50 plus units of affordable low-income housing over there, which is really something that
they're beautiful apartments.
They're absolutely fantastic. Yeah. And there are quite a few other mills still remaining in the city that are either vacant or underutilized and represent development opportunities. Developers can leverage some federal incentives to do some development in those places, and we'd like to see them do that. Again, we're in competition with every other city in town and a lot of other states even to get developers interested in those projects. But yet, I think New Bedford's a great place to live. I'm certainly proud to live here. I love living here, and I think we can, if we really put our mind to it and align our resources properly, we can get those buildings developed, and we can provide more housing options for people.
One thing that the mayor has talked about that he's against is rent control. I mean, you hear that from people. First of all, I don't know if people know the definition of rent control, but I know the mayor has obviously done this initiative instead of, quote, rent control.
Yeah, so there's been talk locally of rent control or rent stabilization proposals. There's a Boston proposal where the city council, with their mayor Wu, have proposed a rent stabilization program there, which is now at the legislature. So the legislature has to either approve or deny that. There's also, I think, a movement building in the state to try to angle for a statewide ballot question regarding rent control, because in the 90s, rent control in Massachusetts was made illegal. It's actually illegal to have rent control policies. There are different definitions. There are different types of ways that those programs work, and the details matter quite a bit. We opt in our plan, and we make this clear here, that we think that the best way to get at this problem is by taking on that supply and demand problem. So the reason the prices have risen to the levels that they have are because the demand just outstrips the supply by such a dramatic factor. So the answer is to add more supply. One of our fears, and we've heard this from some developers already, is that if you put programs in place that add barriers, that add limits on the rents that can be charged, or limits on the way that they have to conduct their business, that's a disincentive to come and develop in a community. So if our problem is we need to develop more units, but we kind of spook the developers away by introducing some of these proposals, that could be a negative thing. Which is not to say that developers intend to charge sky-high rents, but it's more paperwork, it's more compliance. Often, I think Boston proposes a rent control board that a developer or a landlord would have to go before periodically. And when you can develop anywhere in the state without those restrictions, it's just one more thing for a developer to have to think about here in the city. So we're not in favor of that proposal, but we definitely understand the compulsion to take action on a problem that's very serious for a lot of people.
But the city is taking action. I think that's the biggest thing that people should realize. It is happening. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's going to do it. Busy half hour. I appreciate you coming in. We'll stay on top of it. And thanks for coming in, and best of luck here as you begin your endeavor.
Thanks, Jim. I need the luck, and I need your partnership and everybody else's. So please get a copy of the plan on our website. It's on the City of New Bedford Office of Housing Community Development website. You could Google it and find it there as well. And if anybody knows of development opportunities or has questions or comments on the plan, certainly encourage them to reach out to us, reach out to me directly, and we're happy to talk it through.
That's going to do it for this edition of City Hall Insider. I'm Jim Marshall of the New Bedford Cable Network. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you again soon.